6 weeks after they locked Abigail Rourke out of her husband's forge, 22 men were trapped beneath Red Widow Mountain. The pumps were dead. Water was climbing through the lower mine faster than anyone could clear the rockfall. The nearest replacement part was 60 miles away. The south road had washed out, and the north road was blocked by an overturned freight wagon. The men below had hours, not days. Then someone remembered the widow. The same superintendent who had told Abigail that a woman could not hold a company contract met her in the forge doorway and asked whether she could make the iron coupling that might bring the miners home. Abigail looked past him at the broken part on the floor and the cold hearth behind it. "How high is the water?" she asked. "Waist deep in the lower drift." "How many are alive?" 22, if the bell signal was right. The superintendent began to explain company authority, emergency orders, and what he could promise when the danger had passed. Abigail walked by him without listening. "Light the forge," she said, "and keep everyone out of my way." Granite Hollow, Montana Territory, had been built around a hole in the ground. The Red Widow mine opened in 1878 when two prospectors found a silver vein running beneath the north shoulder of the mountain. Within 5 years, the town had a hotel, 3 saloons, a church, a schoolhouse, and a company store that sold everything from lamp oil to burial cloth. Nearly every roof in Granite Hollow had been paid for by silver taken out of Red Widow. Nearly every family had also buried someone because of it. The mine took fingers, lungs, backs, and sometimes whole men. It rewarded the lucky, exhausted the careful, and eventually made widows of women who had never set foot below ground. Abigail Rourke knew the mine by sound. She knew the slow knock of a loose wheel on an ore cart. She knew the higher ring of a drill bit that had become too brittle. She knew when a pump rod was running true and when a worn joint had begun to strike sideways. Those sounds traveled up from the shaft and through the company yard, reaching the forge before the men who carried the broken pieces did. For 14 years, Abigail had worked beside her husband, Daniel. Daniel Rourke was listed in the company books as master blacksmith. His name appeared on every invoice, every repair order, and every monthly payment. Abigail's name appeared nowhere. That had never matched the truth. Daniel was stronger. Abigail was more exact. He could shape a wagon tire by eye and lift a sledgehammer that younger men needed 2 hands to move. She could study a fractured part and tell whether it had failed from bad iron, poor heat, or a mistake made months earlier. Daniel liked the first strike. Abigail liked the last measurement. They met in St. Joseph when Abigail was 21 and Daniel was 26. He came into her uncle's hardware store for square-cut nails. She told him he was buying the wrong size and pointed out the split boards on his freight wagon. Daniel argued, bought the smaller nails anyway, and returned 2 days later to admit she had been right. They married the following spring. When the Red Widow Company offered Daniel a forge in Montana, Abigail went with him. The forge stood beside the hoist house, close enough that coal dust settled over the anvil before breakfast. It had 1 brick hearth, a hand-cranked blower, 2 anvils, a swage block, and a roof that leaked over the scrap pile. Abigail loved it immediately. At first, miners stopped talking when she entered. Then they learned that she could sharpen a drill without drawing the temper, set a pick so it would not turn in the hand, and forge a chain link that closed clean under load. Men who would not have trusted her opinion on the boardwalk began waiting for her to inspect their tools. Daniel never called her his helper. "This is our forge," he said whenever a company man spoke only to him. The company men smiled and continued writing Daniel's name. In the winter of 1884, the lower pump failed during a cold snap. A coupling on the main rod split from end to end, stopping the mechanism that lifted groundwater out of the deepest workings. The mine superintendent at the time sent a rider to Helena for a replacement. Abigail looked at the watermarks rising along the shaft timbers and said the miners did not have time. She and Daniel worked through the night. The coupling was thick, awkward, and shaped to fit an older English pump that no manufacturer in Montana still produced. Daniel forged the body. Abigail punched the bore, fitted the steel collar, and adjusted the shoulders until the piece seated against the rod without play. The pump ran for 4 more years on that coupling. The invoice read, "Work completed by Daniel Rourke." Daniel had wanted to argue. Abigail had stopped him. "We know who made it," she said. At the time, that had felt like enough. It stopped feeling like enough after he died. Daniel caught pneumonia in January of 1888 after spending 2 nights repairing a freight wagon in freezing rain. He was 41. He had survived runaway teams, mine blasts, kicked horses, and a boilerplate that once missed his head by less than an inch. A fever took him in 9 days. During the last clear hour he had, Daniel asked whether Milo had learned to hold the tongs properly. Milo Vance was their 15-year-old apprentice, a quick-handed orphan Daniel had found sleeping beneath the loading dock 2 winters earlier. "Make him measure twice," Daniel whispered. "I do." He rushes the second heat. "I know." Daniel looked toward Abigail's hammer hanging near the bedroom door. "Don't let them tell you whose hand held it." He died before sunrise. The company allowed Abigail to keep the forge running because there was no one else to do the work. For 7 months, she repaired mine tools, wagon axles, hoist fittings, stove grates, gate hinges, and the iron braces used in the timber sets underground. The mine lost no time because of her. The books stayed clean. The bills were lower than they had been under Daniel because Abigail wasted less stock. No one complained. Then Warren Bledsoe arrived from Butte. Bledsoe was 48, well-dressed, and careful with his hands. He wore gloves even when the weather was warm and removed them 1 finger at a time before every meeting. He had the polished manner of a man who believed courtesy made cruelty respectable. The Red Widow Company had sent him to reduce expenses. He began with lamp oil, blasting powder, and mule feed. Then he studied the contracts. Abigail was fitting a new rim to an ore cart wheel when he entered the forge for the first time. He stood just inside the doorway, waiting for her to stop working before he spoke. She did not. "Mrs. Rourke, the rim is hot. I can see that. Then you can see why I'm not putting it down." Bledsoe waited until she seated the iron around the wooden wheel and cooled it with a slow stream of water. Steam filled the forge. Milo worked the crank blower without looking up. Bledsoe removed his gloves. "I've reviewed the company agreements," he said. "Your husband's contract ended with his death." The work did not. "No, but the arrangement must be regularized." Abigail set the tongs aside. "What does regularized mean?" "It means the company requires a recognized contractor, a man with appropriate standing, business surety, and legal capacity. I have been doing the work for 8 months. I do not question that you have been useful." Useful. The word landed exactly where Bledsoe intended it to. He explained that the company had hired Caleb Dorr, a blacksmith from Helena. Dorr was 33, unmarried, and recommended by one of Bledsoe's cousins. He had experience shoeing cavalry horses and repairing freight wagons. Abigail asked whether he had worked on mine pumps. Bledsoe said iron was iron. "No," she said, "it isn't." Bledsoe's expression barely changed. "Mr. Dorr arrives Monday. You may remove your personal belongings before noon." The forge, the large tools, the stock, and every pattern inside belonged to the company. Abigail could take Daniel's hand tools, her own hammer, and anything she could prove had been purchased privately. Milo stopped turning the blower. Bledsoe looked at him. "The boy may remain under Mr. Dorr if he wishes." Milo's face reddened. Abigail spoke before he could. "The boy decides for himself." Bledsoe put his gloves back on. Of course. The news traveled through Granite Hollow before Abigail finished the wheel. Men came to the forge that afternoon to call the decision a shame. One offered to speak to the shift boss, then admitted his oldest son had just been hired underground and he could not risk angering Bledsoe. The school teacher brought bread. The hotel owner said everyone knew Abigail was the better smith. No one offered a building, coal, or a contract. At noon on Monday, Caleb Dorr arrived in a new leather apron. He was not a bad man. That made the insult harder to place. Dorr shook Abigail's hand, said he had heard Daniel was an excellent smith, and asked where the company kept the shoeing stock. He spoke as though Abigail were a widow, showing him through a room she had occasionally visited. She showed him the iron racks, the pump patterns, the tool steel, and the shelves of finished parts. Then she stopped beside the cracked coupling Daniel and Abigail had replaced in 1884. Daniel had kept it as a lesson. "The lower pump uses an old rod size," she said. "The spare in the hoist house will not fit without turning the bore. The coupling in service has been striking on the downstroke. I marked it for inspection 3 weeks ago." Dorr glanced at the old broken piece. "I'll look at it." "Look before the rain." He smiled, not unkindly. "I know pumps, Mrs. Rourke." "You know wagons." The smile disappeared. Bledsoe, who had been standing behind them, stepped forward. "That will be enough." Abigail removed Daniel's small cross-peen hammer, 2 pairs of tongs, a set of calipers, and the wooden box where she kept her punches. She left the large hammer hanging beside the hearth. It belonged to her. She had bought it in St. Joseph before she married Daniel, but the receipt was long gone, and Bledsoe had already said proof would be required. Milo took off his apron and followed her. Dorr called after him, "You have a place here, boy." Milo looked at Abigail. "My place is where I'm taught," he said. They carried the tools to Abigail's house at the edge of town. For 6 weeks, Abigail repaired kitchen knives, stove latches, and farm tools on a small charcoal hearth Milo built behind the shed. It was work, but not enough. She sold Daniel's Sunday coat, the spare bed frame, and one of the milk goats. Milo began taking meals at the church so she would not notice how little he ate at home. She noticed. Rain began in the 2nd week of October. Granite Hollow was used to snow, wind, and sudden cold. Rain was more dangerous. It entered the mountain through old cuts, fractures, abandoned shafts, and every place men had opened stone and then forgotten it. The Red Widow pumps ran day and night. Abigail could hear them from her porch. The main rod rose and fell with a deep iron rhythm. On the 3rd evening, the rhythm changed. There was a double knock at the bottom of every stroke. Abigail stood in the rain and listened. Milo came outside carrying a blanket. "What is it?" "The lower coupling." "You can hear that from here?" "I can hear it from the way the mountain answers." The next morning, Abigail went to the company office. Bledsoe was reviewing payroll. Dorr stood near the stove with his coffee. "The lower pump joint is loose," Abigail said. "Shut it down and pull the rod before it splits." Dorr set down the cup. "I inspected it." "When?" "Last week. It changed 3 nights ago." Bledsoe did not look up from the ledger. "The pump is operating. It is striking on every downstroke." Mr. Dorr inspected it. Then he missed it. Dorr's face tightened. Bledsoe closed the book. "Mrs. Rourke, you no longer work for this company. You do not have access to the shaft, the machinery, or the maintenance records. You are hearing a mine pump from half a mile away and asking me to halt production. I am asking you to stop one pump for 4 hours, at a cost of nearly $300 in lost ore, at a cost smaller than 22 funerals." The room went quiet. Bledsoe rose. "The company is not paying for a widow's nerves." Abigail looked at Dorr. He looked away first. She left. 2 days later, the rain became a storm. Water crossed Main Street in brown sheets. The stage from Helena stopped running. A freight wagon overturned at Miller's Bend, blocking the North Road. By evening, Red Widow Mountain had disappeared behind low clouds. The night shift went underground at 6. 22 men descended to the lower workings, among them shift boss Owen McCrae, Luis Ortega, with 6 children at home, newly married Nathan Webb, and Samuel Reed, whose son had been hired the week Abigail lost the forge. At 8:40, the pump coupling split. The men on the surface heard the rod strike the shaft wall 3 times. Then the pump stopped. At 8:43, an old timber set failed in the wet ground above the lower incline. Rock, mud, and broken beams came down across the passage. At 8:45, the bell line from the lower level rang 3 times. 3 pulls meant men alive below. At 8:47, it rang twice more. Then nothing. Granite Hollow heard the mine whistle before 9. It gave 6 long blasts, paused, then gave 6 more. Doors opened all over town. Men ran toward the company yard pulling on coats. Women followed carrying lanterns, blankets, and whatever fear allowed them to remember. Abigail was already awake. She had heard the pump stop. Milo came through the kitchen door without knocking. The whistle, I heard it! They reached the mine yard as the first rescue crew came back from the shaft. The lower incline was blocked. Water had reached the miners' boot tops before the collapse. Without the pump, it would rise through the lower drift and cover the refuge ledge before morning. Caleb Dorr stood in the forge with the broken coupling on the floor. The iron had split through the collar exactly where Abigail had expected. Beside it lay the company spare. It was too large. Dorr had tried to reduce the bore with a chisel. He had cracked one shoulder and ruined it. Bledsoe saw Abigail in the doorway. For the first time since arriving in Granite Hollow, he did not look polished. Rain ran from his hat, mud covered one trouser leg, one glove was missing. "Can you make another?" he asked. Abigail looked at the broken coupling, then at the damaged spare. How high is the water? Waist deep in the lower drift. How many are alive? 22 if the signal was right. The road to Helena? Gone south, blocked north. Bledsoe began to speak about emergency authority. Abigail stepped past him. "Open the forge," she said, "and keep everyone out of my way." The hearth was cold. Dor had let the fire die while trying to alter the spare. Milo shoveled coal. Abigail opened the air gate, checked the tuyere, and pulled off her wet coat. Her large hammer still hung beside the hearth. Bledsoe followed her gaze. "That belongs to the company." Abigail took it from the wall. "No," she said, "it never did." She examined the broken coupling under lamplight. The old iron had crystallized around the crack. The bore was worn oval. The pump rod had probably swollen where it struck the shaft wall. A direct copy would not fit. She needed fresh iron, a steel collar, and a drift slightly larger than the original bore. Dor said the forge had no stock thick enough. Abigail pointed toward the scrapyard. "There is an ore cart axle under the west rack." Dor shook his head. "Too soft." "It came from the old Jackson carts. They were wrought iron from Pennsylvania." "How do you know?" "I repaired them before you knew this town existed." Milo and two miners dragged the axle inside. Abigail tested it with a file, then struck the end against the anvil. The ring was dull but clean. It would work. She ordered Dor to cut a 20-inch section. He hesitated only once, then he obeyed. The company yard filled with people. Rescue crews attacked the upper side of the collapse while water climbed below. The mine doctor organized blankets. Women boiled coffee and tore sheets into bandages. Children watched from the loading shed until someone sent them home. Inside the forge, Abigail heated the axle section. Black became red became orange. Orange moved toward yellow. "Now," she said. Dor swung the sledge. Milo turned the blower. Abigail held the iron and directed every strike. Center, again. Left shoulder, not the edge, again. The axle shortened and thickened beneath the hammer. At 10:30, a runner came from the shaft. The bell line had sounded once. No clear signal. At 11, the water had reached chest height in part of the lower drift. Owen McCrae had led the men to an old ventilation raise where the floor stood higher, but the refuge would not remain dry long. Abigail punched the first opening through the hot iron. The drift entered crooked. She stopped. Dor said they could correct it on the next heat. "No, if the bore begins crooked, the rod will strike again. We don't have time to start over. We don't have time to make the wrong part." She reheated the iron, closed the bad opening, and began again from the opposite side. Bledsoe appeared at the doorway every few minutes, each time asking how long. Abigail ignored him until he stepped inside and told Milo to increase the air. She turned on him. "You wanted authority. Use it outside. The men are drowning, and they will drown faster if you burn this iron." Bledsoe looked at the color in the hearth. To him, it was simply bright. To Abigail, it was the difference between grain that would hold and grain that would split. He stepped back. Near midnight, the coupling had its rough shape. Abigail fitted the steel collar around the body and prepared the forge weld. She scattered sand across the joint, returned it to the deepest part of the fire, and watched the surface. Milo's arms trembled at the blower. "Switch," she said. A miner took his place. Milo protested. "You cannot feel the heat if your hands stop obeying you," Abigail said. "Rest 5 minutes." Daniel had told her the same thing during their first winter. The memory came so clearly that for 1 second she expected to see him standing across the anvil, sleeves rolled, waiting for her signal. Instead, Caleb Dor stood there with the sledge. He looked afraid, not of Abigail, of failing the men below. "I should have pulled the rod," he said. "Yes, I heard the knock yesterday." She looked at him. "I told myself it was the guide timber." "Why?" "Because Bledsoe did not want the pump stopped. Because you had warned him. Because I thought agreeing with you would make me look like I could not do the job." The iron reached welding heat. Abigail lifted it from the fire. "Then learn something before you swing." Dor raised the hammer. They welded the collar. The first blows were heavy. The next were controlled. Abigail turned the piece between strikes, keeping the joint even. Sparks burst around the anvil and died against the wet floor. Outside, the mine bell rang once. Everyone in the yard stopped. A minute later, it rang once again. 2 separate pulls, not a company signal. A miner near the shaft said the trapped men were striking the bell wire by hand. Abigail listened. Another faint pull came through, then another, slow, uneven, alive. Milo stared toward the open forge door. "Can they hear us?" he asked. The pump rod ran down the shaft past the blocked incline. Iron carried sound better than stone. Abigail raised her hammer and struck the coupling 3 times. The blows rang through the forge. A few seconds later, the bell answered once. No one spoke. Abigail struck again. The men below answered. From then on, every heat began with 3 blows against the anvil. The trapped miners could not see the fire. They could not see the people clearing rock or the women waiting with blankets. But through the old pump column, they heard iron being shaped above them. They knew someone was still working. At 1 in the morning, the coupling was ready for fitting. Abigail did not quench it. Dor reached for the water trough, and she stopped him. "Too much stress at the collar. Bury it in ash. It will cool slower. It will live longer." "How long?" Bledsoe demanded from the doorway. "Long enough that it does not crack when they start the pump." The water below had reached the refuge ledge. Owen McCrae had moved the shortest men onto timber braces above the floor. 2 miners were injured. One had a broken ankle. Another had been struck across the ribs by falling timber. Their lamps were running low. They continued tapping the bell wire. Abigail waited for the coupling to cool. Waiting was harder than hammering. At 1:40, she lifted it from the ash and checked the bore. It was true. Dor smiled for the first time that night. Then Abigail slid the hardwood gauge into the opening. It stopped halfway. The bore was too tight. Milo's face fell. Dor swore under his breath. Bledsoe stepped into the forge. "How far off?" "Less than an eighth." "Then force it." Abigail looked at him. "And split the coupling before the first stroke?" The pump rod itself had swollen from repeated striking. Her gauge matched the old size, not the damaged rod. They needed the exact diameter. A mechanic at the shaft offered to climb down and measure it. The upper section was slick, the guide timbers were damaged, and falling rock still threatened the passage. Abigail took her calipers. "I'll go." Bledsoe said no. She was already moving. The shaft cage could descend only to the upper landing. From there, Abigail and Milo followed the pump column down a narrow ladder to the break. Water roared somewhere below. Mud ran over the timbers. The air smelled of wet stone, lamp smoke, and old explosives. At the damaged joint, the rod leaned against the shaft guide. Abigail measured it twice. Milo held the lamp. A stone fell from above and struck the ladder rail between them. Milo flinched. "Keep the light steady," she said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands wanted to. The rod was wider by 3/32 of an inch. Back in the forge, Abigail reheated the coupling just enough to work the bore without weakening the weld. She drove a larger drift through from both sides, turning the piece after every blow. At 2:30, the coupling slid over the test shaft. At 2:40, men carried it to the pump house. The entire town followed as far as the yard allowed. Mechanics fitted the coupling between the upper and lower rods. Abigail checked the shoulders. Dor tightened the keys. Milo held the lamp close. Bledsoe stood beside the steam valve. "Start it," he said. Abigail put one hand on the rod. Slow. The engine moved. The pump rod descended 6 inches, stopped, then rose. The new coupling held. The second stroke came harder. The rod shuddered but stayed true. On the third stroke, a dull knock sounded from below. Dor looked at Abigail. She kept her hand against the metal, feeling the rhythm through her palm. The fourth stroke ran clean. Then the fifth. Then the pump settled into a deep, steady beat. Water began rising through the discharge pipe. At first it came brown and broken. Then it became a continuous stream pouring into the drainage ditch. The mine bell rang 3 times. Men alive below. The yard erupted. Abigail did not cheer. "The water has to fall before the rescue crew can reach them," she said. "Keep the engine slow for 10 minutes, then increase 1 turn at a time." Bledsoe nodded as though she were the superintendent and he the clerk. By 4 in the morning, the lower drift had dropped below the refuge ledge. At 4:20, the rescue crew broke through the upper edge of the collapse. At 4:50, the first miner came out. Luis Ortega emerged on his hands and knees, coughing mud. His wife reached him before the doctor did. Nathan Webb followed, one sleeve torn away and his face gray beneath the coal dust. Samuel Reed came next, supporting the miner with the broken ankle. They brought the men out one by one, 21. Then the passage went quiet. Owen McCrae was missing. He had stayed behind to hold a timber brace while the injured men crawled through the opening. When the last of them cleared, part of the roof settled again. The rescue crew went back. For 17 minutes, no one came out. Abigail stood beside the pump rod with her hand resting on the new coupling. The iron was warm now, moving with every stroke. Milo stood beside her. At dawn, 2 rescuers appeared beneath the shaft lamps carrying Owen between them. He was unconscious, his left leg twisted, but he was breathing. 22 men had gone below, 22 came back. The sun rose behind the clouds without showing itself. Granite Hollow knew morning had arrived only because the darkness thinned. Owen woke in the company infirmary that afternoon. His first question was whether the pump was still running. His second was who had made the coupling. The doctor told him. Owen closed his eyes. "We heard the hammer," he said. For 3 days, the new coupling ran without stopping. On the 4th day, Bledsoe called a meeting in the company office. Abigail arrived with Milo. Caleb Dorr was already there. So were Owen McCrae, walking on crutches, 6 miners, the school teacher, the hotel owner, and nearly every woman who had waited outside the shaft. Bledsoe had prepared a statement praising the courage and cooperation of Granite Hollow. Abigail let him finish. Then she placed the broken coupling on his desk. "I warned you." Bledsoe looked at the crack. "Yes. You dismissed the warning because it came from me." He glanced at the people standing behind her. "Yes." The admission cost him more than anger would have. Abigail set down a second object, the ruined company spare. "Your contractor destroyed this because he did not know the pump." Caleb Dorr stepped forward. "That is true." Bledsoe looked at him sharply. Dorr continued, "She told me to pull the rod before the storm. I chose pride over inspection. If those men had died, part of it would have belonged to me." The room stayed silent. Abigail did not ask for Bledsoe's dismissal. She did not ask the company to apologize. She asked for terms. The forge contract would be issued in her name. The company would return every personal tool removed or claimed after Daniel's death. Maintenance warnings from the forge would be entered into the official mine record, with the name of the person who made them. No contractor would be dismissed because of sex when the work and accounts were satisfactory. Milo would be registered as a paid apprentice, not a charity boy. And Caleb Dorr, if he wished to stay, would work under Abigail until she decided he understood mine iron well enough to take responsibility for it. Bledsoe stared at her. "You are in no position to dictate company policy." Owen McCrae shifted on his crutches. 22 of us think she is." One miner stepped beside him, then another. The hotel owner spoke from the back. "So does everyone who fed your rescue crews." Bledsoe looked through the office window at the mine yard. Men were standing outside, waiting. For years, the company had depended on Granite Hollow, believing each family stood alone. That morning, the town did not. Bledsoe signed. The Red Widow Company removed him 3 months later after an internal review found that he had postponed 6 maintenance repairs to improve the quarters' expenses. Caleb Dorr stayed. For the first 6 months, Abigail gave him every dirty job Daniel had once given Milo. Dorr swept scale, sorted scrap, cleaned the tuyere, and learned to listen before claiming he already knew. He became a good minesmith. Milo became better. By 19, he could judge a drill's temper from color alone. At 23, he opened a wagon shop in Bozeman. Above his first anvil, he hung a small wooden gauge with a bore 3/32 wider than standard. He never explained it unless someone asked twice. Abigail remained at the Red Widow Forge for 17 years and trained 11 apprentices. 3 were girls from mining families who had been told there was no honest work for them outside laundries and kitchens. Abigail taught every apprentice to measure twice, never rush the second heat, and distrust anyone who said iron was simply iron. The coupling forged on the night of the flood remained in service for 9 years. When the mine modernized the pump, the company removed it and offered the piece to Abigail. She placed it beside the old cracked coupling Daniel had saved in 1884. One showed what happened when warning was ignored. The other showed what could happen when someone finally listened. Years later, Granite Hollow still argued about what had saved the 22 men. Some named Abigail's skill. Others credited the rescue crew, the women who organized supplies, the mechanics, or the trapped men who kept the bell line moving. Abigail said a rescue was many ordinary people deciding at the same time not to look away. But the miners remembered something else. They remembered in black water with their unable to see the shaft, the rescue crews, or the storm above them. Then the first hammer blow traveled down the pump rod. 3 strikes. A pause. 3 more. The sound came through iron, stone, and water. It told them the town had not forgotten where they were. They had locked Abigail Rourke out of the forge because they believed the name on the contract mattered more than the hands that had done the work. That night, beneath Red Widow Mountain, the difference became impossible to ignore. If Abigail's story stayed with you, tell us what you believe courage sounds like when no one can see it. Subscribe to Dusty Mercy for more forgotten stories from the American frontier.